The attachment of savages to their lawless liberty, the fact that they would rather be at hopeless variance with one another than submit themselves to a legal authority constituted by themselves, that they therefore prefer their senseless freedom to a reason-governed liberty, is regarded by us with profound contempt as barbarism and uncivilization and the brutal degradation of humanity. So one would think that civilized nations, each formed into a state by itself, must come out of such an abandoned condition as soon as they possibly can. On the contrary, however, every state thinks rather that its majesty, the majesty of a people is an absurd expression, lies just in the very fact that it is subject to no external legal authority. And the glory of the ruler consists in this, that, without his requiring to expose himself to danger, thousands stand at his command ready to let themselves be sacrificed for a matter of no concern to them. The difference between the savages of Europe and those of America lies chiefly in this, that, while many tribes of the latter have been entirely devoured by their enemies, Europeans know a better way of using the vanquished than by eating them, and they prefer to increase through them the number of their subjects, and so the number of instruments at their command for still more widely spread war. Immanuel Kant. For a number of weeks, I have talked about what Kant has to say about states' right. What is the state for? What is the difference between ruling and governing, and how should a state be governed? How should punishments of crimes be conducted? How to improve the state? Should we have a revolution? How can we rather improve it through reform? Now that I'm done with that, I want to move on to the next level of public right, which is the right of nations, which is basically that which nowadays is called international law. But in previous centuries, you had this term jus gentium, so the right of nations, the right of peoples. Before I get into that, let me remind you, if you have seen my previous lectures on Kant's philosophy of right, or let me introduce you if you haven't listened to those lectures, what Kant's general thoughts on right are. Kant distinguishes the private right from the public right, saying that even in the state of nature, which would be a condition where people live without states, without institutions, without established laws, and without anyone enforcing those laws. Even in the state of nature, there is right and wrong. And you can ask reason what would be right. All right in general to Kant is about the mine and yours, as he calls it. So it is about property, be it that which is mine by birth, the innate rights, so you could say the human rights, right? That which is my property by birth, like my body, my bodily autonomy, not being harmed, not having my freedom taken away, or acquired rights. So that which is not mine by birth, but which maybe becomes mine at some point, like my house, my bike. And even in the state of nature, you can ask reason, how should you act? And reason would tell you to respect what is not yours, what is belonging to someone else, just like he should respect what is yours. The issue, however, is that this state of nature is a state of perpetual war. not necessarily constant fighting. That's not what Kant is saying. But it is a state of at least potential war, because there could always be conflicts arising, and if there's a conflict, since there is no law, no general law that says what is mine and yours, it is up to my and the other party's individual judgment. And since there's no judge to decide between us, and even if there's no executive power to enforce that judgment, the only way to resolve that conflict is ultimately through fighting, so through war. And of course, in such a war, the winner will not necessarily be he who is right, he whose position is just according to reason, but rather the winner will be he who is stronger. Which is precisely why we should leave the state of nature, the state where there's only private right, and why we should enter a state of public right, that is publicly declared right. Why we should, through a social contract, erect institutions that determine what is right for everyone, that establish laws, and that judge by those laws and that enforce those laws. And so, if right in general is about the mine and yours, is about property, but in the state of nature, so where you only have private right, there is no harmony when it comes to the mine and yours, and therefore there is war, then the public right in general is about giving everyone a guarantee that what is his and will not be touched by others, or at least if others touch it without his permission, they will be punished. And so this public right has one task really to Kant, the task of ending this state of nature, which is a state of war, and therefore the task of establishing perpetual peace, because everyone is secured in what is his. The motto of the public right is the old suum quique tribur, give to each his own, which Kant interprets in the sense of give to each a guarantee of his own, give to each a guarantee that what is his will remain his, will be respected as his. And this public right in general to him has three levels, which can be deduced from his table of categories. The table of categories I explained in its own lecture. Those three levels being the state's right, so the right within one state, which I discussed in the previous lectures. Then the people's right, which I want to discuss in this lecture and also in the next lectures. And finally, the cosmopolitan or the world citizen's right. But all three, being parts of public right in general, have this one task of creating perpetual peace. Now, of course, when we hear the words war and peace, we are used to think in terms of the right of nations. So we usually think of war and peace between states, between peoples. But to Kant, it applies to all levels of public rights. So to him, there's also war and peace between individuals. And the state is precisely there to end the war between individuals and to create peace between individuals. But the problem is now that even if the state succeeds in that, that of course already requires a lot. And of course, some states are more despotic, some are more republican, Of course, there are failed states, there are states that have internal civil wars. So here the mine and yours of the citizens, of the individuals in the state is not secured. But let's assume now that within the state there has been established a condition of universal justice. Everyone got what is his, everyone is secured in his property, and so therefore there is peace between the people. Then still we have the problem that there's more than just one state. There are several states existing alongside each other, and between those there once again can arise conflicts. Kant says that those states on a higher level can be considered, even though of course they are made up of several individuals, they can be considered as being single individuals that once again live in the state of nature with each other. So in a state of lawlessness, of anarchy, where everyone is his own judge and the enforcer of his own judgments and laws. And here, once again, conflicts can arise. And as always, when it comes to right, to Kant, it is about the mine and yours. So it is about properties. And so, in a sense, Kant is being very realistic when it comes to wars between states. Of course, Kant is an idealist, as I discussed in other lectures, like the lecture on Kant's transcendental idealism. But you could say that his approach here is very realistic. One might even call it materialistic, in the sense that Kant does not say wars are fought for ideological reasons. There are wars of faith or whatever. That might be the superstructure, that might be the excuse given. But at the end of the day, Kant would say wars are fought between states or between peoples because they disagree about the mine and yours. Just like individuals may do, like I may have a neighbor, we may both have a garden, and my apple tree, the branches might grow beyond the fence, and now an apple might fall into the neighbor's garden, and I might say it's mine because it comes from my tree, and he might say it's his because it landed on his land. And so a conflict could arise that in the state of nature could only be solved through us beating each other up over that apple, while if you have stateswide, if you both live in one state, you can solve this by going to court and letting a neutral judge decide for you. Just like that, Kant would say the conflicts between states or people are about property. So about resources or about land. And let me remind you, I discussed this in the lecture on the original acquisition and the theory of the ground, that to Kant, all property at the end of the day comes from land ownership. So you first need to own a piece of land, and then you can own what is on that land, the animals walking around there, the trees growing there, the crops you may grow there, the metals that may be in the ground. But you can only possess these things rightfully if you first possess the ground where they are on. So at the end, the conflicts between states are mainly about ground, or about what is in that ground, right? So two states that both are at the same coast, might quarrel over an island off the coast and to whom belongs that island, or maybe the oil fields and the water there. And indeed, if you look at conflicts around the world, they are about property or about land, right? Um, the state of Muscovy and the state of Ukraine might both claim the peninsula of Crimea and disagree, therefore, about what is mine, what is yours. Both saying at the same time, this is mine. Likewise, the Israeli Jews will say that the land between the river and the sea is theirs. Now, if they are believers, they may say that it was given to them by God, promised to them as their holy land. If they are more secular, they might simply say that they have been there already in antiquity and they have a historical, cultural connection to that land. While on the other hand, the Palestinians will of course say that the land is theirs. They have lived there continually for the last hundreds of years at least. And so it is them who have a real claim and connection to that land. So once again, there is not an ideological or let alone religious dispute at first. So those questions might play into it, of course. But rather at first, we can look at this materialistically. At first, there's a clear conflict about what is mine, what is yours. And the same is true of the past, right? Like the Germans and the French in the past disagreeing about Alsace-Lorraine. To whom does this land belong? So the issue here is that, of course, as I already said, the different states or the different nations are in the state of nature once again. So all they can do when having a conflict about a mine and yours is engage in war, where the winner will not be he who has justice on his side, but he who is stronger. And so the task of the law or the right of nations is to end this state of nature between peoples and to once again establish a condition of public justice that gives to each his own and that gives to each a guarantee, a security that what is his will remain his, that he will not tomorrow be attacked and robbed of his land, for example. And this is very important. You might think naively that the word peace is quite clear in its meaning, and that when you want to establish peace, you have to discuss how can you establish it, how can we get to world peace, but we don't have to discuss what it is that we want to establish. But no, before discussing the how do we get there, we first do need to know where do we even want to get, what even is it that we want. And while everyone may think that he knows what the word peace means, it turns out that most people don't. And I find that especially the last year since the attack on Ukraine have very much shown that many people don't understand what peace is. They often confuse peace simply with the absence of fighting. But to that, Kant would say, again, the state of nature, even if there's no fighting currently, is a state of at least potential war, at least cold war, because there's nothing preventing war from breaking out, right? two countries that live in a state of nature alongside each other don't have peace. Because the only reason why your country is not attacked by the other country currently is because the other country currently does not want to attack you. Now, maybe they don't want to attack you because they actually are good people. But as I said in previous lectures, like the one on what is justice, to Kant, we should not have to rely on everyone being angels. That is, on everyone being morally good. Then we would not need the right, then we would not need laws in the first place. Rather, the right has to assume that everyone is not an angel but a devil, and has to create conditions where that would still work, where there would still be peace, despite everyone being devils, everyone being evil, simply through working with everyone's self-interest. It could also be that the other country does not attack us not because they are good, maybe they would like to attack us, but because there's no opportune moment for that, because they don't think that it would be worth the cost, that they could win currently. But such things might change. Even if now we seem strong and invincible, so that anyone who would attack us would have to be mad, we can never be quite sure that this will remain the case, that there won't arise opportunity for our enemies to attack us. So if our peace depends on simply others, either because they are good or because they don't see it as beneficial for themselves right now, not wanting to attack us in the moment, since that can change and war could break out in theory at any moment, this is no peace at all. A real peace to Kant is a peace that is guaranteed, is a peace where the other side does not just choose right now to not attack us, but cannot realistically attack us. And this is a condition that we need to somehow create. And this is the task of what is nowadays called international law, what Kant would call the right of nations. It has one task: creating perpetual peace between states or between peoples, creating a condition of justice on earth. Now, this leads to two questions. First, what is justice in this case? How to determine the mine and yours? And second, how to establish it? And the first question is quite easy to answer here. I don't have to go into detail here because I already discussed it in my lecture on what is justice, where I said that to Kant, justice would mean precisely a state where everyone's property is guaranteed, everyone has something to live off, and would therefore be a state that everyone could agree to, right? That is not forced onto some because it benefits others but not them, and so they would never accept it except through being forced to accept it. But rather, justice is a condition that everyone could actually want, that everyone could agree to. And so, as I explained in that lecture on what is justice to Kant, there's a test that you can use to determine whether an action or whether the maxim, the principle out of which that action is done, whether it is just. And that test he calls the maxim of publicity, an experiment of reason, as he says. And namely, you should ask yourself this maxim, could it stand publicity? If it would become public, would it destroy itself? If it relies on being hidden, then that can only be because not everyone would agree to it, and that shows us that it cannot be a just maxim. So, right, if you try to poison someone's food to kill him, that will not work if you make it public, if you let the person know, I just poisoned your food, please eat it now. Um, so thereby you can see that maybe you want to poison his food, but he himself probably wouldn't agree to that. So you can only make him eat the poisoned food by not letting him know that he's eating poisoned food. Likewise, when you're stealing someone's purse from his pocket, um, if you made that public, if you let the person know what you're doing right now, that would probably harm your enterprise. And this principle, since it is a general principle for justice, Kant would also apply to the justice between nations. So you only have to ask, what would happen if we made this public? So take, for example, spying on one another, right? This does not work so well if people know that they are being spied on. So we have known since Snowden, I mean, you could basically know before that already, but at least since Snowden, it's very clear and it's proven beyond doubt that the US, that the NSA is spying on more or less everyone, including even its allies, like us here in Europe. I want to emphasize that this is not a new development. This is not something that Trump has been doing, because of course nowadays there's a lot of shock here in Europe about Trump's politics towards Europe or towards NATO, towards his own allies, about Trump wanting to annex Greenland. But as I have said before in other lectures, Trump is not the first president to follow politics of America first. Biden, Obama, Bush, all his predecessors have also followed the principle of America first. Trump is just, which of course is ironic as he is considered the big liar always, Trump is just being more honest than others. And maybe he's a bit more extreme, a bit more ruthless in following that principle. But it has always been the basic principle of American politics. It's not like before they would consider themselves part of a community of equals. Like before, they would meet their allies on eye level, but rather, sure, they did not try maybe to annex Greenland, but they were already spying on their allies. But the point is now, if you ask yourself, is this just? Is this something a state should do? Spying on other, even allied states? Well, it's very clear that spying works best if the person being spied on does not know that he's being spied on. If you know that you are being spied on, then maybe you will not say certain things, knowing that you are being listened to. And so you know that this is unjust. Or likewise, take the wars of Muscovy. If you ask yourself, was the attack on Ukraine just? You just have to ask what would have happened if it had not been a surprise attack, but rather if they had announced that attack beforehand. Now, Ukraine would have secured its borders more, would have prepared for the fight more, and also the Western states, the states of Europe, would probably have supplied Ukraine with weapons earlier, or maybe even given Ukraine guarantees against being attacked, or they would have started sooner to try to disentangle their economy from Muscovy, to try to be less reliant on Moscovian gas. So, in other words, announcing that attack would have been harmful to its success. I mean, even without announcing it, the attack is not exactly a success. The 3-day military operation, special operation, has been going on for a few more than 3 days already. But imagine if it had been announced. So imagine if in 2014, after taking Crimea, Putin had clearly stated, this will not be the only chunk of Ukraine I take. In a few years, I will attack again. Or imagine if before that, when illegally attacking Georgia in 2008, he would have announced, and in a few years, I'm coming for Ukraine, I'm gonna take Crimea. So, with this, you can see that this is unjust. And of course, the same goes for the past, right? Like, the whole appeasement politics towards Hitler, towards the Nazis, would probably not have been done, and they would probably have been defeated earlier if they had clearly announced their intentions. Like if Hitler, after the so-called Anschluss of Austria to Germany, had said, this is not the end, this is just the beginning. Next, I'm coming for Czechoslovakia and the Sudetenland, and that will also not be the end of that. Later, I'm gonna attack Poland. And then maybe the Western Allied powers would have acted sooner and would have drawn a red line. So, using Kant's principle, this maxim of publicity, we can see what is just or what isn't just between nations, what should or what shouldn't happen. But of course, knowing that is one thing, and enforcing that, making sure that people or that states, that nations actually act according to that, is quite another thing. I think it is quite the obvious thought, one that I had even long before reading Kant, and yet that is discussed so rarely in public discourse, to look at states or at nations like individuals that are in the state of nature, that are in the state of a lawless anarchy with each other. It's so, it seems to most people to just be a given that there is no law beyond the states, above the states, that the states are simply sovereign and simply doing to one another whatever they want, and that it's a lawless jungle where basically the strongest rule. But then, why should that be? That's not what we want between individuals either. Between individuals, at least most people would agree that it's good that there's laws and that there is a state above those individuals enforcing those laws. So why should that not also be the case between the states? But instead, states will even outright refuse that, and often their citizens will agree with that when the states refuse to submit to some sort of international law, right? Like there are many states, particularly the big powers like the US, like Moscow, like China, that don't submit to the Rome Statute, that don't submit to the International Criminal Court. Indeed, the US even, and once again, this is not something that Trump established, this is older. So the US has always been a woke state. The US has always followed the principle America first. They even have this law saying if a US citizen ever was to be brought before the International Criminal Court, they would attack to get him out. So they are fully prepared to invade The Hague, a peaceful allied nation, the Netherlands, in the heart of Europe, a fellow NATO member, um, just to rescue a war criminal, which is, I think, the most clear way to say we don't accept any law above us. We don't accept submitting together with other nations to a universal law of conduct, but rather we want to be able to do whatever we want, to follow our arbitrary whims, to serve our self-interest, even if it harms others. Or likewise, take the Israelis, who not only have declared the Secretary General of the UN persona non grata, who is denied access to their country, but also who again and again, and this is something you hear both from their politicians but also from ordinary people, again and again will say, what is this international law to us? What is this rules-based world order to us? These rules, who even made them? Why should we have to submit to them? Those are not our rules. We are on our own anyways. No one is helping us, so no one can tell us what to do. No one can tell us how to defend ourselves. I mean, again, imagine this on the level of stateside. Imagine an individual talking like that, saying, why should I submit to this state, be it the Israeli state or the US state or the German state or whichever state you live in? Why should I follow these laws? They are not my laws. No one can tell me what to do. Yes, we can tell you what to do. You are not alone on this world. You are part of a community. You are living with other human beings. So you definitely have to submit to common laws that are in place for us all. And this is a common issue. I already addressed it in previous lectures, like my lecture on particularly why there should be a state, why we need a state. Kant makes a distinction between two kinds of freedom. There is the lawless, boundless freedom that he usually calls the wild freedom or the savage freedom. And there's the freedom under the law, which is somewhat restricted by laws. This distinction I discussed in the lecture on freedom. And the ironic thing is that this wild, unrestricted freedom will usually destroy itself, precisely because there are no restrictions, right? If you are free to kill one another, then you will probably be killed, and that will make you a bit less free, probably. So freedom should be brought under a law that restricts it, of course not too much, otherwise the law is despotic if it becomes oppressive, restricting freedom more than is needed, but it should restrict freedom as much as is necessary in order to retain freedom. So for example, there should be a law against murder, which sure takes the freedom to murder others from me, but also ensures that I don't get murdered and thereby don't lose my freedom. Now, what Kant says is that savages, people that are used to this wild savage freedom, often very much passionately want to defend that freedom, that they often refuse to be brought under a law. They would rather keep living in this wild, unrestricted state, even though it's a state of insecurity, of constant threat, of constant risk of being attacked by others, rather than submit to a law. Kant says that savage nations or savage tribes They resist the law, they resist civilization. He says that savages, like for example in North America, certain Indians that for a while lived in civilization, maybe served in a European army, yet still in the end usually want to go back to their life in savagery, to their tribes. And this, to Kant, as I explained in that previous lecture on why we need a state, this to him is barbaric. The barbarian is, at least that's one definition of the barbarian in Kant, the barbarian is the savage who insists on keeping his savage freedom, right? So first, if you're just a savage, like just an unrestricted tribesman in the wild, you are just a savage. But if we try to bring you under the law, to restrict your freedom in a rational manner in order to protect it, and you actually rebel against that, you actually try to resist this rational restriction of your freedom, then that makes you more than a savage, then that makes you a barbarian. And what Kant is saying is that, once again, this is not true just on the individual level, this is also true on the level of nations. So just like individuals don't want to give up their savage freedom, likewise nations don't want to give up their savage freedom and submit to an international law, submit to international institutions like the UN, like the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court. They will probably talk about their sovereignty, meaning thereby their ability to follow their arbitrary self-interest and to be ruthless. And therefore, such nations that are savage, maybe not inside, maybe inside they have laws, but outside in their relations to other nations, and that want to remain in that savage state, that refuse to be brought under law, they therefore are barbaric nations. And I must say here, I always found it, let's say, interesting that especially those people, those right-wingers who will, within the state, be the most authoritarian, who will constantly be talking about law and order, who will constantly ask for harsher punishments, who will constantly want to deport criminal immigrants, and who will attack people like peaceful protesters, peaceful activists, saying that those people are terrorists, that those people are creating chaos. I find it interesting that those very same people, when we are not talking about the national level but the international level, are precisely those people who are not for law and order, but rather who insist on living in a lawless jungle, who want the world to be a sort of Wild West with the rule of the strongest, and who absolutely refuse to submit themselves and their nation to higher institutions and to higher laws. If anything, they will even use conspiracy theories to fight against this. They will say that this is all a ploy to create one oppressive world government, right? That this is the new world order, and this is some sort of conspiracy by the globalists, by George Soros, by the Jews, by the lizard people, by the Illuminati. I mean, however they want to call them, it's essentially always the same anyways. And that is quite telling, that tells you that they are not people of principles, of integrity, that really do care about the rule of law, that really do care about order and about ending the lawless anarchy in their own state. But they just want to push for their racist or even fascist politics, and they just want to get rid of people they don't like, and they just want a despotic state. Because if they really had this as a general principle, then they would also apply it beyond the state. And here Kant says we should not think too highly of our own level of civilization, and we should not look down too much on others as being barbaric, because we too are being barbarians, and because our civilization is not moralization. Now, I will talk more about this distinction when I get to Kant's anthropology and his philosophy of history eventually. But basically, to Kant, people can be civilized and they can be moralized, and it's not the same, because civilization is about the outside. It is about the outer actions, about your conduct. So you are civilized if you have a certain decorum. You are civilized if you have a certain decency. So, for example, in a civilized nation, they will not constantly fight on the street, right? You will not just be attacked because you looked at someone funny, and they will not murder each other because maybe they have some vendetta going on, right? In a civilized nation, if someone murders someone from your family, you will not immediately murder someone from their family. Sure, some nations can be more civilized than others. There can be more internal peaceful conduct, and there can be more decency in how people treat one another. But that is not to say that such a nation is necessarily more moral. Here you might check out my lecture on the goodwill, because to Kant, morality is not so much about our actions, but rather it is about having a goodwill. You are a moral person if you actually want to do good. So only if your good actions, or if you're abstaining from evil actions, comes from a goodwill, only then are you a good person. So sure, a moralized people would act like a civilized people, but a moralized people would act in that way because they actually are good. But it's also possible that you act in a certain manner because you're forced to from the outside, like maybe there are laws in place that restrict too uncivilized conduct, that force people to behave. Or you can also act in a civilized manner because you were raised that way, because of your socialization and how you are used to act. So that means that a nation can be fully civilized without having any goodwill, without having any morality. And this will then show in their outer conduct, Kant would say. So in their conduct, not to one another within, but in their conduct towards other nations. And here it turns out that the people that may be most civilized inwardly, outwardly can still act completely uncivilized. And that, again, to Kant, is a definition of barbarism. So barbarians to him are those people who inwardly may treat one another with a certain degree of civilization, um, but outwardly they crush others without mercy, and they don't show any degree of civilization in their conduct towards others, which of course makes the barbarians much more dangerous than the savages, right? Like savages, they will be individuals or maybe very small tribes, and so therefore they could be dangerous maybe for another individual, right? Like some years ago there was this case on this Sentinel Island by India, where there's a tribe that has been uncontacted. It has not had any contact with other human beings, and someone went on that island and got killed. Um, but savages are not gonna be a problem for a nation, right? It's not like these people, these tribesmen will get off their island and will attack some state. And even if they were to try that, any state could easily deal with them. Barbarians are much more dangerous because since they are civilized inwardly, they can work together, right? If they were uncivilized, they would probably be fighting one another, or they would probably be unorganized and therefore not pose a big threat. But since they have attained a level of inner civilization, they can work together, and they can now form a horde that can overrun and crush others, right? Think of barbarians of the past, be it the Mongolians that invaded and conquered large parts of Asia and even into Europe. Think of the Vikings that, while the more southern, Christianized parts of Europe were somewhat civilized, they came from the outside as barbarians, attacking that civilized world and plundering it. And of course, they inwardly also may have had a degree of civilization. Otherwise, they could not have worked together on their ships. They were not constantly fighting one another. But outwardly, towards those Christian Europeans they attacked, they were acting as barbarians. Same is true of the Corsairs of Northern Africa later, right? That would, from the northern coast, what is nowadays Tunisia and Algeria and Morocco and so on, with their ships attack European ships and enslave people. So towards the Europeans, they would act as barbarians. Well, Kant is saying that civilization and that laws within a state may ensure that certain bad or evil qualities that people may have, like aggression, like greed, like lust for power or whatever, either do not show at all, or if they come out, if they show themselves at all, then at least they will do so not in a raw and unrestricted manner like they would do in the state of nature, but in a somewhat more civilized manner, right? So nowadays in our civilized societies, someone might still be greedy and have lust for power, and so at his work he might be an asshole towards his colleagues, and he might ruthlessly try to advance his career even at the cost of others. but at least he's not gonna go around and just beat people up or stab people or whatever. So civilization will somewhat make sure those bad qualities people have don't show themselves, or at least don't show themselves in such a harmful way. But the point is, at least as long as there was no true moralization, which would then make those bad qualities go away altogether, um, then those bad qualities that are being held back by civilization, by laws, can always come out again. And they will do so as soon as you leave civilization, as soon as you turn towards those that are outside your civilization. And here, once again, Kant says, we, that is, the Europeans, the Western nations, and this is true in his time, and I would say this is also true in our time, of course, we don't have to think so highly of ourselves. Maybe we indeed are the most civilized part of the world, but that doesn't mean that we are more moral. And outwardly, we still behave as barbarians, right? The modern barbarians, the Americans or the Israelis or the Europeans, really aren't much better than the older barbarians, the Mongols or the Vikings or the Berber Corsairs. Indeed, in many ways, they are even worse. They are even more barbaric. I mean, the Europeans around the time of the Renaissance might have been inwardly civilized, but then when the Spanish discovered America, and when the conquistadors took over southern and middle America, like for example the Aztecs in Mexico, just look how they behaved there. I mean, from the perspective of those Aztecs, suddenly people from across the sea appear, people to whom we have never done anything because we didn't even know they exist, and they attack us and they destroy our way of life, our culture. They enslave us, they kill us, they force their faith on us. So, from their perspective, those also civilized Europeans probably weren't better than the Vikings had been from the perspective of those Europeans a few centuries before that. Um, and Kant, in his own days, to him, the prime example are the British. Kant says that the British have now had a proper inner civilization and lawfulness, some sort of rule of law, a proper civil constitution for about 100 years. So he's saying that at the end of the 18th century. So he's saying they've had that since the end of the 17th century. He's of course referring to the English Revolution of 1688. You could of course say that to some degree they've had some sort of rule of law, some sort of constitution, even since the Middle Ages, since the Magna Carta. But at least since that revolution, they, according to Kant, have had a somewhat lawful constitution. And maybe in his day, they were the most civilized people of Europe, at least until the French Revolution. But, Kant says, in their outer conduct towards other nations, they are the greatest barbarians. And this is true in how they treat people outside of Europe, right? How they treated the Native Americans in North America, how they treated people in Africa, how they treated people in India. This is true even with their colonial conduct within Europe. I mean, consider how they treated the Irish, um, that also suffered from colonialism and apartheid and genocide for the longest time, till at least about 100 years ago. And if we count Northern Ireland, then in a way it's going on till today. But even other European nations that are also civilized are not treated as equals by the British, Kant says, right? Towards the continental nations like France, like Prussia, like Austria, like Muscovy, um, the British also engaged in ruthless power politics. I mean, that politics for the longest time had the aim to keep the balance of powers on the continent intact, making sure that no single power grows too strong and defeats the others, so that no one can really threaten the English on their island, and no one can really threaten their global maritime empire, their trade, their ships. Um, but yeah, they did not care for any rules of conduct, of proper warfare, for any international law, but rather they were being ruthless barbarians. And what Kant says here also reminds me of Nietzsche in his critique of morality and of the hypocrisy of the common morality. And with Kant, we could say it's more the common civilization than actual morality. Because Nietzsche says at some point that many qualities that within a state are not wanted, treated as bad qualities or bad actions, and are persecuted as such. Murdering, stealing, plundering, lying, spying on others. If you do those same things in the service of the state, not within the state to your fellow citizens, but without the state to other peoples, then for doing the very same things that you would otherwise be condemned for, you actually become a hero, right? The murderer who murders his own people is a murderer, but the murderer who, as a soldier, murders other people is a hero fighting for his fatherland. Um, Indeed, we can see in our time that the Moscovians, for their attack on Ukraine, turned to their prisons and they released convicted murderers to have them fight as soldiers, promising them that if they fight as soldiers, they will be released altogether and will get their freedom back. And this has been shocking to some people, this news. And this is something that Muscovy has been condemned for. But in a way, I find it quite consistent and quite honest. Here you can see that certain qualities, like being willing to take a life, like a certain aggression, a certain ruthlessness, qualities that make you unwanted and a pariah within your state, within your civilization, might actually make you very useful to that state, if the victims are others, if the victims are the outsiders. And the same you could say, for example, about the US with Guantanamo. I mean, there's a reason that Guantanamo is not within the US itself, on US soil. Because if it was, of course, then you could sue them for that. Then, of course, this would be highly illegal, right? Because at least to some degree, within the US, there is a rule of law and there are human rights. Of course, only to some degree. Of course, there's still the death penalty in several states, and of course, the conditions in the prisons are terrible and so on. But at least they cannot do everything they want. But here, you have a completely lawless area where laws simply don't apply, because you are outside of your own civilization. And so you could just abduct people from anywhere around the world, kidnap them, and imprison them there without charges, without them getting a lawyer or ever seeing a judge, and could just torture them however you want. But Kant has to say here about barbarism and about how inwardly civilized nations can be very barbaric outwardly reminds me of the Polish Jewish jurist and legal scholar Raphael Lemkin, who in the 40s was the one to first come up with the term genocide. Now, of course, at that time, the Nazis were conducting genocide in his own home area, Poland and Eastern Europe, against his own people, the Jewish people. But Lemkin had dealt with this problem even before it became so personal. Already in the 30s, he had talked about this sort of problem. And he had done so mainly because of the genocide committed by the Turks against the Armenians. But also he had considered other similar acts that European nations had committed in the course of their colonialism, like in Africa or in America. And Lemkin had been of the opinion for a while that there was a sort of crime, a sort of collective crime, where one nation attacked another nation or another people, another group as such, not just many individuals, not just committing mass murder, but attacking the group as such. Leaving all rules of civilization and civilized warfare behind, that the international law at that time could not grasp, and that therefore we needed a sort of new law to forbid and to persecute this kind of crime. And in the 30s, Lemkin suggested as a name the crime of barbarism. So he wanted to make that an international crime. Also, the crime of vandalism was also something he suggested, which was more to be about sort of cultural genocide. But yeah, barbarism was about a barbaric conduct, committing crimes against humanity in trying to destroy a group. So Lemkin had recognized that otherwise civilized people could act as barbarians towards others. Right? The warfare within Europe, so amongst the civilized people, at least until the First World War, that was sort of a turning point. But before that, in the 19th and also in Kant's time in the 18th century, had become somewhat civilized. It was mostly armies shooting one another, but not the previous plundering and burning down of cities and looting of the countryside and burning and raping and pillaging and so on. So the European nations, at least for a time, had reached a point where they recognized one another as civilized nations and acted civilly even during war, but only amongst one another. As soon as they got to, let's say, Africa, so as soon as they dealt with people that they did not consider to be on their level of civilization, then the rules of civilized conduct did no longer apply. And then they were committing acts of barbarism. And even when Lemkin had already moved past this crime of barbarism and came up with this term of genocide, still others, like for example Adorno, characterized the Nazis as barbarians. Indeed, here you can think of Hannah Arendt and her concept of totalitarianism. I recently gave a lecture where I somewhat explained that concept and applied it to current day Muscovy or the US, but mainly to current day Israel. So you might want to check that lecture out if you're interested in that. But Arendt also, to some degree, identifies totalitarianism with barbarism. She also, like Kant, would probably say that barbarism is not simply savagery, because a single savage is not causing so much harm, but rather that the barbarians are a horde. So they are people that have banded together and therefore, at least to some degree, inwardly must be civilized and not savage, but that are all the more savage, that is barbaric, outwardly. And you could say that Arendt's theory of totalitarianism is simply that this barbarism now turns inward. So that these are no longer barbarians like the Mongols or the Vikings, or like the European colonial powers that are barbaric outwardly but not towards one another, but that these are barbarians whose barbarism has turned inwards. Indeed, to Arendt, the colonialism or the imperialism at the end of the 19th century is at the root of the later totalitarianism. And she would say that there's always the danger, if you are acting like a barbarian outwardly towards others, that this comes back and that you start acting like a barbarian towards your own people also. And this danger is especially big if there's no clear distinction between them, like in the case of overseas colonial empires like the British or the French one, but rather if you have a land empire like the German one or the Moscovian or Soviet one, that is where totalitarianism can arise, because there is no clear border, no clear distinction. And so the barbarism with which you treat others, you start treating your own people with that same barbarism, which is what we can also see with Israel, right? Where there's also no clear border between Israel proper and the West Bank, and they are acting like barbarians there. And with the judicial reform, this barbarism is coming back home. So this, you could say, if you apply Kant to Arendt, if you understand Arendt through Kant or the other way around, is what totalitarianism means. This barbarism no longer just being applied to others, but to your own people. And in that sense, it is correct that in Germany later on, the Nazi crimes have been described as Zivilisationsbruch, that is, as a break or as a rupture of civilization. That is certainly true in the sense that the civilization within Germany or within Europe that we previously had um, was broken, was torn up, and the Nazis brought barbarism home. But at the same time, this shock over the rupture of civilization, over the Zivilisationsbruch, is of course also to some degree dishonest and hypocritical, because we had already acted like that before the Nazis in previous decades and centuries outside of Europe. I mean, ask the Africans how the Europeans acted there. Like, take the Congo, for example, which had been a colony of Belgium, or basically the personal property of the Belgian king Leopold II, and terrible crimes were conducted there. It was exploited for rubber production. Lots of people were killed. Then, because the Belgians thought that their soldiers were being too mindless, too wasteful with their munition, they ordered them to only shoot to kill, meaning that for every single bullet that they shot, they had to prove that they had killed someone. And how did they have to prove that? By showing a human hand, which led to them cutting off hands from lots and lots of people, including people that were still alive, including children, and collecting these dried up hands in baskets. And to this day, it's hard to get the real numbers, but historians assume that between 10 and 20 million people were murdered in the Congo. So, and this was, of course, done by Belgians and by the Belgian king, a civilized nation. The king himself certainly had grown up within European civilization, had grown up with proper manners, like a proper nobleman, like a proper ruler of the time. This did not keep him from committing such crimes. And also, if we just look at Germany, the Germans in their own colonies had committed terrible crimes, including genocide, the first genocide of the 20th century, starting in 1904, was committed in nowadays Namibia by the Germans in their colony of German Southwest Africa, as it was called back then, against the Herero and Nama people. And there they already learned lots that the Nazis would later apply in Europe. They are also the first German concentration camps, even already bearing that name, were built. So, yeah, we can be shocked about the Zivilisationsbruch that the Nazis committed in Europe. But if we ask people in Africa or people in India, they would probably say, well, we didn't see much civilization from you guys before. The civilization, if it was ever there already, was broken. There already was a rupture. So now with the Nazis, with totalitarianism, this just came back home. But anyways, I want to go one step further still and point out that what Kant has to say about this barbarism that civilized people can commit against other people is not limited to just warfare and to just the way we directly kill others. There's also barbarism, like economic barbarism and so on. I mean, here too, you can very clearly see double standards and hypocrisy. So, for example, we will now pride ourselves in Europe or in the West in general that we have certain laws to protect workers, right? There's minimum wage and there's maximum work hours in the week or on the day. and there's certain restrictions to protect workers. The factories have to be built in certain ways to be safe, right? Have to be fire exits, for example. Of course, all those things have only been in place for 100 years or less. All those things had to be fought for. Um, Workers were exploited and workers were basically without rights in Europe for the longest time. But now we have these things in Europe, but then outside of it, what about it? What about the people in, let's say, Bangladesh or Cambodia that produce our clothes, for example, or the people in Chinese factories that may produce our electronic devices? Um, how are they treated? There still you have workers that have to work for almost nothing, that have to work like 12 or 14 hours a day, that aren't even allowed to take a break for eating or for going to the toilet, which of course leads to health problems. Um, that work in insecure buildings that can break down or where fires can break out, that are beaten and abused by their overseers and so on, um, just so that we can, for example, buy new cheap fast fashion, or that we can buy the newest iPhone. And I mean, this is known. It's not like I'm saying anything that is a secret. It's not like I have some sort of secret information. It's not like I'm being a big whistleblower here. Everyone knows this. I mean, if you didn't know what I just said, then I don't know what rock you have been living under. But people completely ignore that while going shopping. People clearly don't care about this exploitation. The very same people who would probably not want to exploit their own nation in that way, who would probably protest if people here were treated that way, have absolutely no problem with people elsewhere being treated that way, or even people here if they are not from here. I mean, I could also talk a lot about the way we in Germany, for example, treat workers from, let's say, Romania or Hungary that come here to work in German slaughterhouses to provide the meat for German dinners. Um, or likewise, we in the West claim to care about children a lot and about protecting children. We have, of course, laws against child labor. We have laws to ensure that children go to school, that they get an education. We have laws against child abuse through the parents. And we care especially much about sexual abuse of children. We Many people will want harsh punishments for people who rape children, will demand the death penalty for that. It's a big scandal. Like, you can see how much the Epstein files are steering up. It's a big scandal if someone turns out to have abused children. Um, and yet our way of life is built on the abuse and exploitation of children, right? Again, in those factories, for example, in Bangladesh, producing our clothes, there are underage people, there are people aged, I don't know, 14 or younger, working there. Again, many hours, 10 hours, 12 hours a day, without any security, just for our fast fashion, or the electronics that we use, the resources for that, like the rare earths, um, they are mined sometimes by children that die in those mines, or there are child soldiers fighting essentially for our resources, fighting wars in Africa, that are essentially economic wars for the resources for our devices. And again, this is known by everyone. You cannot claim to not know that. Um, and yet, people, when going shopping, don't care about that much. And likewise, here we have certain rules about contracts, about business deals. Here we want people to not be exploited and so on. But then the EU is look how the EU is dealing with African nations, how they pressure them into unfavorable contracts, free trade agreements, threatening to otherwise not give them development money. And then you have agreements that allow the EU to sell their shitty products, like, for example, some parts of meat that you would not sell on the European market, that Europeans would not want to eat, sell them cheaply in Africa, which destroys the local economy because local farmers cannot compete with the prices. And then those farmers are jobless. Or likewise, we go and fish empty the waters along the coast of Somalia, and then the fishers there are jobless. And of course, if those same farmers and those same fishers whose livelihood we destroyed, if they now come here as refugees, then we will reject them. Then we will not want them as refugees. Then we will deport them. If they even get here, because that's of course another thing, right? We will talk about our human rights, and we will of course be against murder and so on. But then you have many thousands of refugees that we drown in the Mediterranean Sea while they try to cross here from Africa. And yes, they are being drowned. I mean, it's a fact that we could save them if we wanted to. It's not like we don't know that they are there. I mean, the Mediterranean is also observed by the EU. There are drones flying over the Mediterranean, surveillance drones that we bought from Israel, for example. So if we wanted, we could save those people droning there. But we let them drone. This is a conscious choice by our politicians, and this is the choice by the voters who vote for those politicians. There are also, despite it being forbidden, there are also pushbacks, of course, where boats are being pushed back out of European waters back into international waters where we are not responsible, allegedly. And of course, we also make sure that people don't even get that far, that they don't even get to the Mediterranean. We pay lots of money to the states in Northern Africa, like Libya, for example, to hold those people back, which essentially means erecting concentration camps where those refugees are forced into, or also pushing refugees back into the desert, back into the Sahara Desert, where they will then die. And this is something, I mean, we know that this is what our money is used for, but we choose not to know. We choose to ignore it. So there is no civilization here. And this you could go on and on and on about. Likewise, we will say that we care very much about human rights in general, about democracy, about freedom, and still we have absolutely no problem dealing and trading with countries that don't have those things, right? Buying our products from China, buying our gas from Moscow, at the very least till it fully attacked Ukraine, buying our oil from Saudi Arabia. I mean, we know that in Saudi Arabia there's no freedom. that people in general are oppressed, that women are oppressed, that a critical journalist can be um, murdered and hacked into pieces. We also know of the war they conducted for years in Yemen. We know that at the border with Yemen, when there are refugees, be it from Yemen itself, be it from Africa after having crossed the Red Sea, that they are being murdered by Saudi soldiers at the border, or that soldiers force male refugees at gunpoint to rape women and girls, even. Um, we know those things. We know that China is authoritarian, is surveilling its own people, um, suppress the democracy in Hong Kong, that it is committing not one genocide but two genocides against the Uyghurs and against the Tibetans. This is known. All of these things are known, and yet it doesn't bother us when trading with those countries and thereby supporting it. And this goes across the board, right? Like, doesn't matter where people stand politically. So on the one hand, we have these right wing and conspiracy theory people who will claim to care so much about freedom, about democracy, about freedom of speech, who in past years during the COVID pandemic were talking about the end of freedom, about a totalitarian dictatorship. Here in Germany, they talked about a new GDR, so a return of the socialist Eastern German dictatorship, just because they had to wear a mask for some minutes while being on the bus or while buying groceries. And here you very clearly see um, that these are not principled people that care about freedom in general, because they are not protesting for the freedom of the people in China or in Saudi Arabia. They are not saying, let us not support such despotic regimes. And that's how you know that back when they protested against the COVID restrictions, they were also not protesting for freedom. They were just out for their self interest. They were just protesting for their own savage freedom, for freedom not to be restricted by laws in order to remain free, but rather for their savage freedom to follow each arbitrary whim, other people be damned. But it's not just those right wingers, it's also the good, decent, humanist liberals that will talk about freedom and human rights a lot, but have no problem trading with such countries. And likewise, especially here in Germany, we claim to be against Nazis because of our past, right? Here in Germany, they talk a lot about the Brandmauer, the firewall, against the right wingers, the AfD parties. So the other parties have agreed to not work together with them. I mean, even in Germany, that is crumbling. But even so, here they will say, oh, we mustn't ever work together with Nazis. But then, of course, they have no issue working together with right wing, with racist regimes in other places of the world, like in Israel. So it's very clear that not just in the way we conduct our wars, but in general, when it comes to dealing with others outside the West, we are barbarians. And so, therefore, there might have been progress in civilization, but there hasn't been progress in moralization at the same time. And you can say that not so much has changed since the time of the ancient Greeks, because an ancient Greek city state also inwardly had a certain degree of civilization. And the people there, at least the free men, of course, slaves and women, that was, of course, another story, but at least the free men had some degree of rights, of living under some sort of rule of law. Um, treating each other in a somewhat civilized manner. But then when it came to how they treated others, and not just outside of Greece, not just the Persians or whomever, but even fellow Greek city-states, they acted like total barbarians, right? If they defeated another city in a war, they plundered, they sold and drove the people into slavery and so on. And there's not so much progress here. And in our current day, you can especially see how great the abyss can be between inner civilization and outer barbarism at the same time, through the example of Israel. In the West, there has been this image of Israel as the villa in the jungle, as a former Israeli prime minister put it, as this oasis surrounded by bloodthirsty barbarians that, for no reason at all, just because they hate life and they follow this death cult that is Islam, and because they're anti-Semites, and because they hate Jews more than they love their own children, keep attacking Israel. When the Israelis are such nice people, loving life, dancing in the desert, like dancing on stolen land. And of course, this image has been crumbling somewhat, especially in the last 2 years, especially in other places. Here in Germany, it's still almost impossible to criticize Israel. But of course, this image never had so much to do with reality. I mean, people like to imagine Israel as being basically Tel Aviv, and Tel Aviv as being this cosmopolitan, open-minded, friendly, liberal city full of startups and creative people and so on. And totally ignoring the fact that just a few minutes drive by car from Tel Aviv, you have a military dictatorship and apartheid regime. But my point is that, of course, this image is not fully wrong. I mean, sure, there is another Israel that has been on the rise more and more. There are the right-wingers, there are the fundamentalists, there are the fascists that are now in the government. And it's not even me calling them that. I mean, they're calling themselves that, right? Finance Minister Smotrich often openly said, I'm a racist, I'm a homophobic fascist. He's not hiding it. But of course, such a person would never be capable of a genocide, and the government he's part of would never commit a genocide, of course. Of course, there are the fundamentalists, there are the settlers, and so on. But still, there is, of course, the civilized, the liberal Israel. It's not completely imagination. But the issue is that it's not just the fascist right-wingers, it's also precisely those civilized liberals that engaged in the genocide. And I mean, the examples of Israel's barbarism are, of course, countless. And if you haven't willfully ignored them in the past 2 years, then you know them. Then you know, of course, that Israeli soldiers have posted their own war crimes on TikTok, showing themselves doing funny sketches in ruined Palestinian homes, showing themselves dressing up in the underwear of Palestinian women. Then you know, of course, that Israel is conducting its warfare with the help of AI, that it uses such tools like Lavender or Where is Daddy, where it lets AI determine whether somebody might belong to Hamas. which is probably determined by the relationships he has, like who is he related to, whom has he met, whom has he called with his phone. And so um, maybe you have a cousin who once bought something at a shop, whose owner once called someone whose dog has once been petted by someone who belongs to Hamas, and so therefore you probably also belong to Hamas according to the AI, and then you get targeted. And depending on how high up you are in the ranks of Hamas according to the AI, um, it's programmed to accept larger or smaller numbers of civilian causalities, right? So even if you're a low-ranking member, then it's totally fine to hit you with a rocket if it kills also 20 uninvolved civilians. And if you are a higher-ranking member, according to the AI, then the rocket might as well kill 200 civilians. Or this where's daddy tool, um, where the AI tries to find out if someone from Hamas came home, and so now you can shoot a rocket at that home, knowing full well that the guy you are targeting is there with his family and not alone. And of course, we know that Israelis are mocking Palestinians on social media, posting TikTok videos of themselves pretending to be starving Palestinians with starving babies. We know, of course, that Israeli children or Israeli teenagers are doing prank calls where they call their parents pretending to represent some organization that is collecting donations for starving people in Gaza. And then their parents will get aggressive and will shoot at them, will insult them, and the kids will post those videos where they can barely contain their laughter. And we of course know that people in Israel are singing songs like "May Your Village Burn." They are singing that at parties. They are singing that on school buses. People are saying they enjoy the thought of the suffering in Gaza. Right? There have been these two dudes on a podcast, and not just random marginalized extremist dudes, but rather one of them is part of the PR team of the Prime Minister of Netanyahu, who say on that podcast, yeah, it's nice going to party, going to dance with my girlfriend, knowing full well that some kilometers away people are being murdered, being bombed, being starved. And it would be even better if at that party we had a screen where we could watch the destruction of Gaza while we are dancing. And we of course know that civilians have taken part in the starving of Gaza, that civilians have blocked trucks with aid from entering Gaza, that they have even made their children be part of that blocking. And we know, of course, not just of the torture in Israeli prisons where people are handcuffed so tightly that the blood circulation is stopped and that they have to be amputated by unqualified medical personnel, or where people are being raped, including raped with rifles, raped with fire extinguishers, raped by dogs, raped to death even. We also know that like one rapist was caught on camera, and when they tried to persecute him in Israel, people protested in solidarity with the rapist, protested for the right to rape prisoners. And this rapist was even allowed to go on TV and to talk about how it's okay to rape prisoners. And countless things like that, right? So the way the Israelis behave, and don't even try to hide it, but behave on national TV or behave online, putting videos of themselves and their war crimes online. Frankly, it's unrealistic, right? If it didn't happen, we probably wouldn't believe it. I mean, they're behaving not simply as evil people, they're behaving like cartoon villains. Like, it's cartoonishly evil. If you were to create a story, like a book, a movie, where a nation not just commits genocide, but revels in it like that, and does it with such glee, and does such obviously evil thing. I mean, there's no way on earth you can protest in favor of a rapist and think you are the good guy. I mean, that should not be humanly possible, and yet apparently it is. So if that were to happen in a book or in a movie, everyone would say, oh, come on, that's unrealistic. Like, this is too on the nose. You want us to really see that these are the bad guys, but you should have been a bit more subtle about this, Mr. Author. So this is too unrealistic to be real, and yet it is real. And this perfectly exemplifies what Kant says about barbarism. Because, I mean, I've read comments online under certain videos showing the Israeli war crimes and the glee with which they are committed. I've read people saying, oh, this whole society is sick, or all Israelis are psychopaths or sociopaths or whatever. And I mean, it's not that I don't get the sentiment. It's not that I don't get those people commenting such things. They're clearly shocked. They're clearly disgusted, and they are expressing that, which is understandable. But I would say Israel is still a pretty civilized society in many ways, which I'm not saying to in any ways excuse or relativize what they are doing, but I'm saying they are not doing that to each other. I mean, many Israelis would probably still be shocked if, let's say, some soldier or some policeman raped an Israeli and would then brag about it on national TV. And many Israelis would probably be shocked if you were to murder Israeli children and mock them. But it's just that all this inner civilization has nothing to do with moralization. It's just this is how they were raised, this is how they are used to acting in their own society, this is their socialization. So sure, here they act with decency, so to say. But then outwardly, they are still barbarians. And I mean, the soldiers talk about that, right? There's this quote from an Israeli soldier saying, it's also the title of an article in Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, when you go into Gaza, you're God. So you step over this border and there are no rules anymore. There's nothing holding you back. You have all the power. You can do whatever you want. And that article quotes soldiers and quotes the soldiers relating what they did or what they witnessed others doing. X shot an Arab 4 times in the back and got away with a self-defense claim. 4 bullets in the back from a distance of 10 meters. Cold-blooded murder. We did things like that every day. An Arab just walked down the street, about 25 years old. Didn't throw a stone, nothing. Bang. A bullet in the stomach. Shot him in the stomach and he was dying on the sidewalk, and we drove away indifferently. I felt like a Nazi. It looked exactly like we were actually the Nazis and they were the Jews. A new commander came to us. We went out with him on the first patrol at 6 in the morning. He stops. There's not a soul in the streets, just a little 4-year-old boy playing in the sand in his yard. The commander suddenly starts running, grabs the boy and breaks his arm at the elbow and his leg here. Stepped on his stomach 3 times and left. We all stood there with our mouths open, looking at him in shock. I asked the commander, "What's your story?" He told me, "These kids need to be killed from the day they are born." When a commander does that, it becomes legit. I have no problem with women. One threw a slipper at me, so I gave her a kick here, pointing to the groin. Broke all this here. She can't have children today. There's total dehumanization here. You don't really treat them like they are human beings. And I would say this is actually a very good way to distinguish between civilization and moralization. So if you meet a person who in regular daily life seems to be a nice guy, seems to act with decency, you don't know if he is just civilized because maybe he was raised that way, or if he is truly on the inside a good person who is acting like this out of goodwill. Well, I would always tell people, don't ask how somebody treats his own people, how he acts towards his own society. Rather look how he acts towards others that are not considered part of his civilization. There he might be showing his true colors. So this is what Kant says, that you can be also civilized and still all the more barbaric on the outside. Indeed, I would say it seems that the higher the degree of inner civilization, as long as people are not moral at the same time, the greater the barbarism on the outside. And to say one more word about Israel specifically, this is also one reason why it's so simply wrong and ridiculous to accuse those who criticize Israel of anti-Semitism. I mean, it's also incredibly dishonest and evil, of course, but it's also simply wrong, because this is not limited to Israel. I would say, I mean, some people might think it is, but at least for myself, I can say I don't have such a high opinion of human beings as to believe that others in a similar situation would act better than the Israelis, or as to believe that indeed others are acting better. Yes, of course the Israelis are evil. Of course they are scum of the earth. But so are my people, the Germans. So there's nothing specifically anti-Semitic about that. I mean, German SS officers had no problem celebrating a nice Christmas with their children, while a few hundred meters away people were being gassed and then burned. Or likewise, think of the war in Iraq, how the Americans conducted themselves. Think of this case where Americans were shooting from a helicopter just for fun at civilians, like it was some video game. So, I mean, there are people who seem to think that somehow Jews are not human. And this goes both ways, of course. You can think that Jews are worse than other human beings. You can think that it is specifically the Israeli Jews who are sick and psychopathic or whatever. Of course, that would be kind of anti-Semitic. But then there are those claiming to defend Jews and to fight against anti-Semitism, but who also seem to think that Jews are not human beings, which, if you ask me, is kind of anti-Semitic, because they seem to think that specifically Jews are not capable of what clearly everyone else is capable of. No, but the simple truth is that as long as a human being has not become moral, as long as he has not aufklärt himself, then no matter how civilized he is, or maybe even the more civilized he is, the more so, um, he can be the most brutal, the most extreme barbarian and do terrible things to other people. And we have in German we have one saying, soldiers are murderers. Going back to Kurt Tucholsky, who was a Jewish German author and journalist in the Weimar Republic, very often very witty critic of how things were going in the Weimar Republic, someone who early on warned of the rise of the Nazis. And he at some point said this, soldiers are murderers, which was a big scandal back then, because the society was still very much militaristic and soldiers were very much revered. But yeah, that's the thing. Being a murderer is considered bad by a civilized society. You are not supposed to be a murderer. But at the same time, being a soldier who murders others outside that civilization is considered good. And I will just add one more thing that Kant says to all of this. And that is that Kant says, as long as there are wars between nations, between peoples, and therefore as long as this barbarism continues, this will prevent people from moralizing. Maybe they can attain some level of civilization, but they will not ever truly become moral as long as they are used to fighting in wars and so on, and treating others in immoral ways. And he says that at the end of the day, this barbarism will come back. It will come back home. Which makes perfect sense if you think about it. I mean, you cannot treat others in this inhumane way. You cannot strip yourself of your own humanity and get used to treating fellow human beings who have the same face as you, who have a human face, like this, and then just go back home as if nothing happened and be a total normal person and functioning member of society. This is not how it works. And to Kant, this goes both ways. This goes for the ruling and for the subjects. Because the ruling people, of course, as long as they are engaged in wars, they will be more despotic on the inside. War risks making a state despotic. I mean, to some degree, you have to be despotic when engaged in a war, right? Even if it is a just war, even if you're defending yourself. I mean, you have to tax people to finance the war. You have to force people into military service. Maybe you have to postpone elections, right? I mean, this is what the enemies of freedom and the enemies of justice will now attack Ukraine for, saying Zelensky is a dictator, that he is illegitimate because there are no elections. But I mean, this is normal, and many countries, many democratic countries have such laws that during a war, during a state of emergency, you would not hold elections, which makes perfect sense. But at the same time, as long as this is the case and the longer it goes on, of course, there is the risk of things getting more and more despotic in such a country. And then also you will probably have to suppress critical voices who are against the war and so on. So Kant would say, I mean, I talked in an earlier lecture about the difference between despotism and republic, and of course Kant is for the republic, but he would say that it is easier to create and to remain in a republic in peace, while war risks things turning despotic. But also not just the rulers, but also the subjects will carry this barbarism home. Again, you cannot just fight in a war and murder others, and then come home as if nothing happened. And there are, of course, many examples of that. And of course, Kant is probably more thinking of such things, like on an individual level, war, engaging in barbarism harms your morality. He did not yet know totalitarianism. But as I already said, according to Hannah Arendt, totalitarianism is basically this barbarism that you commit towards others coming home and also being committed towards your own people. And of course, this is fluid. There's no clear distinction between individuals, like some traumatized soldier bringing the barbarism home, and the barbarism as such coming home and things turning totalitarian. I mean, Arendt writes about how the front generation that fought in the First World War could not reintegrate into society and just continue on with a normal life as if nothing had happened. How they, even afterwards, despised normal, decent society and reveled in cruelty. And we also see this nowadays, for example, in the US, right? That people that might nowadays work for ICE and murder people for ICE, like that guy who has murdered that woman in Minneapolis, are often former veterans. Like this guy was in Iraq before. So if totalitarianism, according to Arendt, is in a way the rulers treating their own country as if it was a conquered imperial territory that they were conducting war against, which is kind of what Trump is doing more and more, right? When he is sending the National Guard into American cities, when he is threatening cities like Chicago with war. And then if these people, like the people that murder for ICE, if they themselves have been veterans that learned being barbarians first in Iraq or in Afghanistan, then you see the connection. And this last point is why, even if you don't care about other people, about other nations, and even if you don't care about outer wars, as long as they don't come home, even if you don't care about what your country might be doing around the world, which of course would make you an evil person. But even if you are immoral, I would say that even for selfish reasons, you should want this barbarism on earth to end. You should want justice and the rule of law between nations, between peoples to come about. Because otherwise, not just others outside of your country will suffer, but your own country is at risk of suffering, of losing its freedom, of turning more and more barbaric. So even mere self-interest should drive you towards wanting peace. And of course, the question is still, how do we get there? And this is precisely what I want to discuss next. Kant will, of course, say we need law between nations, and we need that law to be enforced. We need an international order. We need international institutions. We need an international federation. And this is something that this is the only way towards peace, because we cannot stay in this state of nature between states and simply rely on hopefully no one attacking each other and hopefully everyone liking each other. No, we need to force states into peace. Force is what the right is about to Kant. I discussed that in the lecture on what is right and what distinguishes it from ethics. Kant says both is about our duties, about what we should do, but ethics is about the duties I make myself do if I have a good will, if I'm a good person. So there are also ethical duties towards myself. I should not commit suicide. I should not take drugs and get drunk or whatever. I should not throw my own dignity away. But this is something I can only make myself do. But the right to Kant is concerned with those duties um, that we should not just force ourselves to adhere to. Of course, we should also do that if we are good people. But they are duties that also come with a right for other people to force us, right? I should not murder others. I should not steal from others. I should not rape others. But even if I don't have the goodwill, so even if I want to do those things, others don't just have to take it. Rather, others have a right to force me to not do this. Others have a right to protect themselves if I try to murder them, for example. And so this is how Kant defines the right. As those actions, those duties, we can be forced to. And this is also true on the level of the right of nations. We need to find a way to force other nations to be peaceful, even if maybe they don't want to. And nowadays you find this criticized by cynical people and especially by ausgeklärt people. So the entwilighted people who think of themselves as aufklärt, as enlightened, but actually aren't, actually are enemies of Aufklärung. They love talking about how, oh yeah, it was nice what Kant dreamed up, but it was naive, and nowadays it has been disproven. We know that he was wrong. Like there are many books, there are many essays by some people who are alleged experts on philosophy who will say such a thing. I mean, first off, I don't see how what Kant suggested in order to achieve peace can have been proven wrong simply because we don't have peace, because it was never tried. I mean, if someone has a deadly illness and the physician says, I have a medicine that can save his life, but then that person does not take that medicine and dies, you cannot say, oh, now that physician was disproven, now we know that his medicine doesn't work. No, we didn't try that medicine. Maybe it would have worked. What Kant suggested was simply never tried, right? Kant did not say wars would end. He said wars could end if we do X. So you cannot say, oh, but we didn't do X and wars didn't end, so Kant is disproven, X doesn't work. That's just stupid. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. This is an argument that if you say this, you deserve to not be listened to anymore. You just excluded yourself from the discussion, because this is not just simply wrong, this is so utterly stupid. I don't know how anyone could come up with that argument and still demand being taken seriously. But on top of that, people who talk like this also show that actually they haven't read Kant thoroughly. Because Kant never claimed that perpetual peace would come about within the next 200 years or so after his death. Quite the contrary. He says at some point it will probably take a long time still, probably as long as 144,000 years. So there's still quite a bit of time left before we can say that Kant was wrong, that Kant was too optimistic, right? So such criticisms of Kant can be dismissed without having to further consider them. But the question is, of course, what does Kant have to say exactly about the law between nations and about an international order that could possibly enforce peace? And this is precisely the thing I want to discuss in my next lecture. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Leo Allmann, Cenk Kubilay Altu, Thomas Deuringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Ökobong, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Spendierhosenträger, Ron Suhl, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.